Marsena Pulford, what time the village of Octavius knew him, was a slender and tall man, apparently skirting upon the 30s, with sloping shoulders and a romantic aspect. It was not alone his flowing black hair and his broad shirt collars turned down after the ascertained manner of the British poets, which stamped him in our humble minds as a living brother to the Corsair, the last of the Suliots, and other heroic personages engraved in the albums and keepsakes of the period. His face, with its darkling eyes and distinguished features, conveyed wherever it went an impression of proudly silent melancholy. In those days, that is, just before the war, one could not look so convincingly and uniformly sad as Marsena did without raising the general presumption of having been crossed in love. We had a respectful feeling in his case that the lady ought to have been named Inez, or at the very least Oriana. Although he went to the Presbyterian church with entire regularity, was never seen in public save in a long-tailed black coat, and in the winter wore gloves instead of mittens, the local conscience had always, I think, sundry reservations about the moral character of his past. It would not have been reckoned against him, then, that he was obviously poor. We had not learned in those primitive times to measure people by dollar-mark standards. Under ordinary conditions, too, the fact that he came from New England, had indeed lived in Boston, must have counted rather in his favor than otherwise. But it was known that he had been an artist, a professional painter of pictures and portraits, and we understood in Octavius that this involved acquaintanceship, if not even familiarity, with all sorts of occult and deleterious phases of city life. Our village held all vice, and especially the vice of other and larger places, in stern reprobation. Yet, though it turned this matter of the newcomer's previous occupation over a good deal in its mind, Marsena carried himself with such a gentle picturesqueness of subdued sorrow that these suspicions were disarmed, or, at the worst, only added to the fascinated interest with which Octavius watched his spare and solitary figure upon its streets, and noted the progress of his efforts to find a footing for himself in its social economy. It was taken for granted among us that he possessed a fine and well-cultivated mind, to match that thoughtful countenance and that dignified deportment. This assumption continued to hold its own in the face of a long series of failures in the attempt to draw him out. Almost everybody who was anybody at one time or another tried to tap Marsena's mental reservoirs, and all in vain. Beyond the barest commonplaces of civil conversation, he could never be tempted. Once, indeed, he had volunteered to the Revmister. Bunce the statement that he regarded Washington Allston as in several respects superior to Copley, but as no one in Octavius knew who these men were, the remark did not help us much. It was quoted frequently, however, as indicating the lofty and recondite nature of the thoughts with which Mr. Pulford occupied his intellect. As it became more apparent, too, that his reserve must be the outgrowth of some crushing and incurable heart-grief, people grew to defer to it and to avoid vexing his silent moods with talk. Thus, when he had been a resident and neighbor for over 2 years, though no one knew him at all well, the whole community regarded him with kindly and even respectful emotions, and the girls in particular felt that he was a distinct acquisition to the place. I have said that Marsena Pulford was poor. Hardly anybody in Octavius ever knew to what pathetic depths his poverty during the second winter descended. There was a period of several months, in sober truth, during which he fed himself upon 6 or 7 cents a day. As he was too proud to dream of asking credit at the grocer's and butcher's, and walked about more primly erect than ever meantime, in his frock coat and gloves, no idea of these privations got abroad. And at the end of this long, evil winter there came a remarkable spring which altered in a violent way the fortunes of millions of people, among them Marsena. We have to do with events somewhat subsequent to that even, and with the period of Mr. Pulford's prosperity. The last discredited strips of snow up in the ravines on the hillsides were melting away. The robins had come again, and were bustling busily across between the willows, already in the leaf, and the budded elms. Men were going about the village streets without their overcoats, and boys were telling exciting tales about the suckers in the creek. Our old friend Homer Sage had returned from his winter's sojourn in the county poorhouse at Thessaly, and could be seen daily sitting in the sunshine on the broad stoop of the Excelsior Hotel. It was April of 1862. A whole year had gone by since that sudden and memorable turn in Marsena Pulford's luck. So far from there being signs now of a possible adverse change, this new springtide brought such an increase of good fortune, with its attendant responsibilities, that Marsena was unable to bear the halcyon burden alone. He took in a partner to help him, and then the firm jointly hired a boy. The partner painted a signboard to mark this double event, in bold red letters of independent form upon a yellow ground. Pulford Shull, Empire State Portrait, Athenum and Studio, war likenesses at peace prices. Marsena discouraged the idea of hanging this out on the street, and as a compromise it was finally placed at the end of the operating room, where for years thereafter it served for the sitters to stare at when their skulls had been clasped in the iron head rest and they had been adjured to look pleasant. A more modest and conventional announcement of the new firm's existence was put outside, and Octavius accepted it as proof that the liberal arts were at last established within its borders on a firm and lucrative basis. The head of the firm was not much altered by this great wave of prosperity. He had been drilled by adversity into such careful ways with his wardrobe that he did not need to get any new clothes. Although the villagers, always kindly, sought now with cordial effusiveness to make him feel one of themselves, and although he accepted all their invitations and showed himself at every public meeting in his capacity as a representative and even prominent citizen, yet the heart of his mystery remained unplucked. Marsena was too busy in these days to be much upon the streets. When he did appear, he still walked alone, slowly and with an air of settled gloom. He saluted such passers-by as he knew in stately silence. If they stopped him or joined him in his progress, at the most he would talk sparingly of the weather and the roads. Neither at the fortnightly sociables of the Ladies' Church Mite Society, given in turn at the more important members' homes, nor in the more casual social assemblages of the place, did Marsena ever unbend. It was not that he held himself aloof, as some others did, from the simple amusements of the evening. He never shrank from bearing his part in pillow, clap in and clap out, post office, or in whatever other game was to be played, and he went through the kissing penalties and rewards involved without apparent aversion. It was also to be noted, in fairness, that if anyone smiled at him full in the face, he instantly smiled in response. But neither smile nor chaste salute served to lift for even the fleeting instant that veil of reserve which hung over him. Those who thought that by having Marsena Pulford take their pictures they would get on more intimate terms with him fell into grievous error. He was more sententious and unapproachable in his studio, as he called it, than anywhere else. In the old days, before the partnership, when he did everything himself, his manner in the reception room downstairs, where he showed samples, gave the prices of frames, and took orders, had no equal for formal frigidity, except his subsequent demeanor in the operating room upstairs. The girls used to declare that they always emerged from the gallery with cold shivers all over them. This, however, did not deter them from going again repeatedly after the outbreak of the war had started up the universal notion of being photographed. When the new partner came in this April of 1862, Marsena was able to devote himself exclusively to the technical business of the camera and the dark room on the second floor. He signaled this change by wearing now every day an old russet-colored velveteen jacket, which we had never seen before. This made him look even more romantically melancholy and picturesque than ever, and revived something of the fascinating curiosity as to his hidden past, but it did nothing toward thawing the icebound shell which somehow came at every point between him and the good fellowship of the community. The partnership was scarcely a week old when something happened. The new partner, standing behind the little showcase in the reception room, transacted some preliminary business with 2 customers who had come in. Then, while the sound of their ascending footsteps was still to be heard on the stairs, he hastily left his post and entered the little workroom at the back of the counter. "You couldn't guess in a baker's dozen of tries who's gone upstairs," he said to the boy. Without waiting for even one effort, he added, "It's the Parmalee girl, and Dwight Ransom's with her, and he's got a lieutenant's uniform on, and they're going to be took together." "What of it?" asked the unimaginative boy. He was bending over a crock of nitric acid, transferring from it one by one to a tub of water a lot of spoiled glass plates. The sickening fumes from the jar and the sting of the acid on his cracked skin still further diminished his interest in contemporary sociology. "Well, what of it?" he repeated sulkily. "Oh, I don't know," said the new partner in a listless, disappointed way. "It seemed kinda curious, that's all. Holding her head up as high in the air as she does, you wouldn't think she'd so much as look at an ordinary fellow like Dwight Ransom." "I suppose this is a free country," remarked the boy, rising to rest his back. "Oh my, yes," returned the other. "If she's pleased, I'm quite agreeable. And I don't know, too. I dare say she's getting pretty well along. Maybe she thinks they ain't any too much time to lose and is making a grab at what comes handiest. Still, I should have thought she could have done better than Dwight. I worked with him for a spell once, you know. There seemed to be very few people with whom Newton Shull had not, at one time or another, worked. Apparently there was no craft or calling which he did not know something about. The old phrase, "Jack of all trades," must surely have been coined in prophecy for him. He had turned up in Octavius originally some years before as the general manager of a whaler's life on the Rolling Deep show, which was specially adapted for moral exhibitions in connection with church fairs. Calamity, however, had long marked this enterprise for its own, and at our village its career culminated under the auspices of a sheriff's officer. The boat, the harpoons, the panorama sheet and rollers, the whale's jaw, the music box with its nautical tunes, these were sold and dispersed. Newton Shull remained and began work as a mender of clocks. Incidentally, he cut out stencil plates for farmers to label their cheese boxes with, and painted or gilded ornamental designs on chair backs through perforated paper patterns. For a time he was a maker of children's sleds. In slack seasons he got jobs to help the druggist, the tinsmith, the dentist, or the town clerk, and was equally at home with each. He was one of the founders of the Octavius Philharmonics, and offered to play any instrument they liked, though his preference was for what he called the bull fiddle. He spoke often of having traveled as a bandsman with a circus. We boys believed that he was quite capable of riding a horse bareback as well. When Marsena Poford then decided that he must have some help, Newton Shull was obviously the man. How the arrangement came to take the form of a partnership was never explained, save on the conservative village theory that Marsena must have reasoned that a partner would be safer with the cash box downstairs while he was taking pictures upstairs than a mere hired man. More likely it grew out of their temperamental affinity. Shull was also a man of grave and depressed moods, as indeed is the case with all who play the bass viol. Only his melancholy differed from Marsena's in being of a tirelessly garrulous character. This was not always an advantage. When customers came in the afternoon, it was his friendly impulse to engage them in conversation at such length that frequently the light would fail altogether before they got upstairs. He recognized this tendency as a fault and manfully combated it, leaving the reception room with abruptness at the earliest possible moment and talking to the boy in the workroom instead. Mr. Shull was a short, round man with a beard which was beginning to show gray under the lip. His reception-room manners were urbane and persuasive to a degree, and he particularly excelled in convincing people that the portraits of themselves which Marsena had sent down to him in the dummy to be dried and varnished, and which they hated vehemently at first sight, were really unique and precious works of art. He had also much success in inducing country folks to despise the cheap ferrotype which they had intended to have made, and to adventure upon the costlier ambrotype, daguerreotype, or even photograph instead. If they did not go away with a family album or an assortment of frames that would come in handy as well, it was no fault of his. He made these frames himself, on a bench which he had fitted up in the workroom. Here he constructed showcases, too, cut out mats and mounts, and did many other things as adjuncts to the business, which honest Marsena had never dreamed of. "Yes," he went on now, "I carried a chain for Dwight the best part of one whole summer when he was laying levels for that Nadama Valley Railroad they were figuring on building. Guess they rather let him in over that job, though he paid me fair enough. It ain't much of a business, that surveying. You spend about half your time in finding out for people the way they could do things if they only had the money to do 'em, and the other half in settling miserable farmers' squabbles about the boundaries of their land. You've got to pay a man day's wages for toting round your chain and axe and stakes, and, as like as not, you never get even that money back, let alone any pay for yourself. I know something about a good many trades, and I say surveying is pretty nigh the poorest of 'em all." "George Washington was a surveyor," commented the boy, stooping down to his task once more. "Yes," admitted Mr. Shull, "so he was, for a fact. But then he had influence enough to get government jobs. I don't say there ain't money in that. If Dwight, now, could get a berth on the canal, say, it'd be a horse of another color. They say there's some places there that pay as much as $3 a day. That's how George Washington got his start, and, besides, he owned his own house and lot to begin with. But you'll notice that he dropped surveying like a hot potato the minute there was any soldiering to do. He knew which side his bread was buttered on." "Well," said the boy, slapping the last plate sharply into the tub, "that's just what Dwight's doing too, ain't it?" "Yes," Mr. Shull conceded, "but it ain't the same thing. You won't find Dwight Ransom getting to be a general or much of anything else. He's a nice fellow enough in his way, of course, but somehow, after it's all said and done, there ain't much to him. I always sort of felt when I was out with him that by good rights I ought to be working the level and him hammering in the stakes." The boy sniffed audibly as he bore away the acid jar. Mr. Shull went over to the bench and took up a chisel with a meditative air. After a moment he lifted his head and listened, with aroused interest written all over his face. There had been audible from the floor above, at intervals, the customary noises of the camera being wheeled about to different points under the skylight. There came echoing downward now quite other and most unfamiliar sounds. The clatter of animated, even gay conversation, punctuated by frank outbursts of laughter. Newton Shull could hardly believe his ears, but they certainly did tell him that there were 3 parties to that merriment overhead. It was so strange that he laid aside the chisel and tiptoed out into the reception-room with a notion of listening at the stair door. Then he even more hurriedly ran back again. They were coming downstairs. It might have been a whole wedding party that trooped down the resounding stairway, the voices rising above the clump of Dwight's artillery boots, and soared on step after step, and overflowed into the stuffy little reception-room with a cheerful tumult of babble. The new partner and the boy looked at each other, then directed a joint stare of bewilderment toward the door. Julia Parmalee had pushed her way behind the showcase, and stood in the entrance to the workroom, peering about her with an affectation of excited curiosity which she may have thought pretty and playful, but which the boy, at least, held to be absurd. She had been talking 13 to the dozen all the time. "Oh, I really must see everything," she rattled on now. "If I could be trusted alone in the dark room with you, Mr. Beaufort, I surely may be allowed to explore all these minor mysteries." "Oh, I see," she added, glancing round, and incidentally looking quite through Mr. Shull and the boy, as if they had been transparent. "Here's where the frames and the washing are done." How interesting. What really was interesting was the face of Marsena Pulford, discernible in the shadow over her shoulder. No one in Octavius had ever seen such a beaming smile on his saturnine countenance before. 2. Next to the war, the chief topic of interest and conversation in Octavius at this time was easily Miss Julia Parmelee. To begin with, her family had for 2 generations or more been the most important family in the village. When Lafayette stopped here to receive an address of welcome, on his tour through the state in 1825, it was a Parmelee who read that address, and who also, as tradition runs, made on his own account several remarks to the hero in the French language, all of which were understood. The elder son of this man has a secure place in history. He is the Judge Parmelee whose portrait hangs in the courthouse, and whose learned work on the treaties of the Tuscarora nation, handsomely bound in Morocco, used to have a place of honor on the parlor table of every well-to-do and cultured Octavius home. This judge was a banker too, and did pretty well for himself in a number of other commercial paths. He it was who built the big Parmelee house, with a stone wall in front and the great garden and orchard stretching back to the next street, and the buff-colored statues on either side of the graveled walk, where the Second National Dearborn County Bank now stands. The judge had no children, and on his widow's death the property went to his much younger brother Charles, who, from having been as a stripling on some forgotten governor's staff, bore through life the title of colonel in the local speech. This Colonel Parmelee had a certain distinction too, though not of a martial character. His home was in New York, and for many years Octavius never laid eyes on him. He was understood to occupy a respected place among American men of letters, though exactly what he wrote did not come to our knowledge. It was said that he had been at Brook Farm. I have not been able to find anyone who remembers him there, but the report is of use as showing the impression of superior intellectual force which he created, even by hearsay, in his native village. When he finally came back to us to play his part as the head of the Parmelee house, we saw at intervals, when the sun was warm and the sidewalks were dry, the lean and bent figure of an old man with a very yellow face and a sharp-edged brown wig moving feebly about with a thick gray shawl over his shoulders. His housekeeper was an elderly maiden cousin who seemed never to come out at all whether the sun was shining or not. There were 3 or 4 of the colonel's daughters, all tall, well-made girls with strikingly dark skins and what we took to be gypsy-ish faces. Their appearance certainly bore out the rumor that their mother had been an opera singer, some said an Italian, others a lady of Louisiana Creole extraction. No information, except that she was dead, ever came to hand about this person. Her daughters, however, were very much in evidence. They seemed always to wear white dresses, and they were always to be seen somewhere, either on their lawn playing croquet, or in the streets, or at the windows of their house. The consciousness of their existence pervaded the whole village from morning till night. To watch their goings and comings, and to speculate upon the identity and business of the friends from strange parts who were continually arriving to visit them, grew to be quite the standing occupation of the idler portion of the community. Before such of our young people as naturally took the lead in these matters had had time to decide how best to utilize for the general good this influx of beauty, wealth, and ancestral dignity, the village was startled by an unlooked-for occurrence. A red carpet was spread one forenoon from the curb to the doorway of the Episcopal church. The old-fashioned Palmely carriage turned out with its driver clasping white reins in white cotton gloves. We had a confused glimpse of the dark Palmely girls with bouquets in their hands, and dressed rather more in white than usual, and then astonished Octavius learned that two of them had been married, right there under its very eyes, and had departed with their husbands. It gave an angry twist to the discovery to find that the bridegrooms were both strangers, presumably from New York. This episode had the figurative effect of doubling or trebling the height of that stone wall which stood between the Palmely place and the public. Such budding hopes and projects of intimacy as our villagers may have entertained toward these polished newcomers fell lipped and lifeless on the stroke. Shortly afterward, that is to say, in the autumn of 1860, the family went away and the big house was shut up. News came in time that the colonel was dead. Something was said about another daughter's marriage. Then the war broke out and gave us other things to think of. We forgot all about the Palmelys. It must have been in the last weeks of 1861 that our vagrant attention was recalled to the subject by the appearance in the village of an elderly married couple of servants who took up their quarters in the long empty mansion and began fitting it once more for habitation. They set all the chimneys smoking, shoveled the garden paths clear of snow, laid in huge supplies of firewood, vegetables, and the like, and turned the whole place inside out in a vigorous convulsion of house cleaning. Their preparations were on such a bold, large scale that we assumed the property must have passed to some voluminous collateral branch of the family, hitherto unknown to us. It came indeed to be stated among us, with an air of certainty, that a remote relation named Amos or Erasmus Palmely, with 8 or more children and a numerous adult household, was coming to live there. The legend of this wholly mythical personage had nearly a fortnight's vogue and reached a point of distinctness where we clearly understood that the coming stranger was a violent secessionist. This seemed to open up a troubled and sinister prospect before loyal Octavius, and there was a good deal of plain talk in the bar-room of the Excelsior Hotel as to how this impending crisis should be met. It was just after New Year's that our suspense was ended. The new Palmelys came, and Octavius noted with a sort of disappointed surprise that they turned out to be merely a shorn and trivial remnant of the old Palmelys. They were in fact only a couple of women. The elderly maiden cousin who had presided before over the colonel's household, and the youngest of his daughters, by name Miss Julia. What was more, word was now passed round upon authority that these were the sole remaining members of the family, that there never had been any Amos or Erasmus Palmely at all. The discovery cast the more heroic of our village home guards into a temporary depression. It could hardly have been otherwise, for here were all their fine and strong resolves, their publicly registered vows about scowling at the odious Southern sympathizer in the street, about a horning party outside his house at night, about perhaps actually riding him on a rail, all brought to nothing. A less earnest body of men might have suspected in the situation some elements of the ridiculous. They let themselves down gently, however, and with a certain dignified sense of consolation that they had, at all events, shown unmistakably how they would have dealt with Amos or Erasmus Palmely if there had been such a man, and he had moved to Octavius and had ventured to flaunt his rebel sentiments in their outraged faces. The village, as a whole, consoled itself on more tangible grounds. It has been stated that Miss Julia Palmely arrived at the family homestead in early January. Before April had brought the buds and birds, this young woman had become president of the St. Young Woman, had become president of the St. Young. Mark's Episcopal Ladies' Aid Society had organized a local branch of the Sanitary Commission and assumed active control of all its executive and clerical functions, had committed the principal people of the community to holding a grand festival and fair in May for the Field Hospital and Nurse Fund, had exhibited in the chief store window on Main Street a crayon portrait of her late father, and 4 watercolor drawings of European scenery, all her own handiwork, had published over her signature in the Thessaly Banner of Liberty, an original and spirited poem on pale Columbia, Shriek to Arm, which no one could read without patriotic thrills, and had been reported, on more or less warrant of appearances, to be engaged to 4 different young men of the place. Truly a remarkable young woman. We were only able in a dim kind of way to identify her with one of the group of girls in white dresses whom the village had stared at and studied from a distance 2 years before. There was no mystery about it, however. She was the youngest of them. They had all looked so much alike, with their precocious growth, their olive skins and foreign features, that we were quite surprised to find now that this one, regarded by herself, must be a great deal younger than the others. Perhaps it was only our rustic shyness which had imputed to the sisterhood, in that earlier experience, the hauteur and icy reserve of the rich and exclusive. We recognized now that if the others were at all like Julia, we had made an absurd mistake. It was impossible that anyone could be freer from arrogance or pretense than Octavius found her to be. There were some indeed who deemed her emancipation almost too complete. Some there were, too, who denied that she was beautiful, or even very good-looking. There is an old daguerreotype of her as she was in those days, or rather as she seemed to be to the unskilled sunbeams of the 60s, which gives these censorious people the lie direct. It is true that her hair is confined in a net at the sides and drawn stiffly across her temples from the parting. The full throat rises sheer from a flat horizon of striped dress goods and is offered no relief whatever by the wide falling-away collar of coarse lace. And oh, the strangeness of that frock! The shoulder seams are to be looked for halfway down the upper arm, the sleeves swell themselves out into shapeless bags, the waist front might be the cover of a chair, of a guitar, of the documents in a corporation suit, of anything under the sun rather than the form of a charming girl. Yet when you look at this thin old picture, all the same you feel that you understand how it was that Julia Parmelee took the shine out of all the other girls in Octavius. This is the likeness of her which always seemed to me the best, but Marsena Pulford made a great many others as well. When you reflect, indeed, that his output of portraits of Julia Parmelee was limited in time to the 2 months of April and May, their number suggests that he could hardly have done anything else the while. The first of this large series of pictures was the one which Marsena liked least. It is true that Julia looked well in it, standing erect, with a proud, fine, backward tilt to her dark face, and a delicately formed white hand resting gracefully on the back of a chair. But it happened that in that chair was seated Dwight Ransom, all spick and span in his new uniform, with his big gauntlets and sword hilt brought prominently forward, and with a kind of fatuous smile on his ruddy face, as if he felt the presence of those fair fingers on the chair back, so teasingly close to his shoulder strap. Marsena, in truth, had a strong impulse to run a destroying thumbnail over the seated figure on this plate when the action of the developer began to reveal its outlines under the faint yellow light in the dark room. Of all the myriad pictures he had washed and drained and nursed in their wet growth over this tank, no other had ever stirred up in his breast such a swift and sharp hostility. He lavished the deadly cyanide upon that portion of the plate, too, with grim unction, and noted the results with a scornful curl on his lip. Like his partner downstairs, he was wondering what on earth possessed Miss Parmelee to take up with a Dwight Ransom. The frown was still on his brow when he opened the dark room door. Then he started back, flushed red, and labored at an embarrassed smile. Miss Parmelee had left her place, and stood right in front of him, so near that he almost ran against her. She beamed confidently and reassuringly upon him. "Oh, I want to come in and see you do all that," she exclaimed with vivacity. "It didn't occur to me till after you'd shut the door, or I'd have asked to come in with you. I have the greatest curiosity about all these matters. Oh, it is all done, that's too bad, but you can make another one, and that I can see from the beginning. You know, I'm something of an artist myself. I've taken lessons for years, and this all interests me so much. No, Lieutenant," she called out from where she was standing just inside the open door, at sound of her companions rising. "You stay where you are. There's going to be another, and it's such trouble to get you posed properly. Try and keep exactly as you were." Thus it happened that she stood very close to Marsena as he took out another plate, flooded it with the sweet-smelling, pungent collodion, and, with furtive precautions against the light, lowered it down into the silver bath. Then he had to shut the door, and she was still there just beside him. He heard himself pretending to explain the processes of the films to her, but his mind was concentrated instead upon a suggestion of perfume which she had brought into the reeking little cupboard of a room, and which mingled languorously with the scents of ether and creosote in the air. He had known her by sight for but a couple of months. He had been introduced to her only a week or so ago, and that in the most casual way, yet, strange enough, he could feel his hand trembling as it perfunctorily moved the plate dipper up and down in the bath. A gentle voice fell upon the darkness. "Do you know, Mr. Pulford," it murmured, "I felt sure that you were an artist the very first time I saw you." Marsena heaved a long sigh, a sigh with a tremulous catch in it, as where sorrow and sweet solace should meet. "I did start out to be one," he answered, "but I never amounted to anything at it. I tried for years, but I wasn't any good. I had to give it up, at last, and take to this instead." He lifted the plate with caution, bent to look obliquely across its surface, and lowered it again. Then all at once he turned abruptly and faced her. They were so close to each other that even in the obscure gloom she caught the sudden flash of resolution in his eyes. "I'll tell you what I never told any other living soul," he said, beginning with husky eagerness, but lapsing now into grave deliberation of emphasis. "I hate this, like pison." In the silence which followed, Marsena mechanically took the plate from the bath, fastened it in the holder, and stepped to the door. Then he halted to prolong for one little instant this tender spell of magic which had stolen over him. Here, in the close darkness beside him, was a sorceress, a siren, who had at a glance read his sore heart's deepest secret, at a word drawn the confession of his maimed and embittered pride. It was like being shut up with an angel, who was also a beautiful woman. Oh, the wonder of it! Broad sunlit landscapes with Italian skies seemed to be forming themselves before his mind's eye. His soul sang songs within him. He very nearly dropped the plate holder. The soft, hovering half-touch of a hand upon his arm, the cool, restful tones of the voice in the darkness, came to complete the witchery. "I know," she said. "I can sympathize with you. I also had my dreams, my aspirations, but you are wrong to think that you have failed. Why, this beautiful work of yours, it all is art, pure art. No person who really knows could look at it and not see that. No, Mr. Pulford, you do yourself an injustice, believe me you do. Why, you couldn't help being an artist if you tried. It's born in you. It shows in everything you do. I saw it from the very first. The unmistakable sound of Dwight Ransom's large artillery boots moving on the floor outside intervened here, and Marsena hurriedly opened the door. The lieutenant glanced with good-natured raillery at the couple who stood revealed, blinking in the sharp light. "One of my legs got asleep," he remarked, by way of explanation. "So I had to get up and stamp around. I began to think," he added, "that you folks were going to set up housekeeping in there and not come out any more at all." "Don't be vulgar, if you please," said Julia Parmalee with a dash of asperity in what purported to be a bantering tone. "We were talking of matters quite beyond you, of art, if you desire to know. Mr. Pulford and I discover that we have a great many opinions and sentiments about art in common. It is a feeling that no one can understand unless they have it." "It's the same with getting one's leg asleep," said Dwight. "Quite the same, I assure you." And then came the laughter which Newton Shull heard downstairs. A day or two later, Battery G left Octavius for the seat of war. It was not nearly so imposing an event as a good many others which had stirred the community during the previous 12 months. There were already 2 regiments in the field, recruited from our end of Dearborn County, and in these at least 6 or 7 companies were made up wholly of Octavius men. There had been big crowds, with speeches and music by the band, to see them off at the old depot. When they returned, their short term of service having expired, there were still more fervent demonstrations, to which zest was added by the knowledge that they were all to enlist again, and then we shortly celebrated their second departure. Some there were who returned in mute and cold finality, term of enlistment and life alike cut short, and these were borne through our streets with somber martial pageantry, the long wail of the funeral march reaching out to include the whole valley side in its note of lamentation. Besides all this, hardly a week passed that those of us who hung about the station could not see a train full of troops on their way to or from the south. A year of these experiences had left us seasoned veterans in sightseeing, by no means to be fluttered by trifles. As a matter of fact, the village did not take Battery G very seriously. To begin with, it mustered only some dozen men, at least so far as our local contribution went, and there was a feeling that we couldn't be expected to go much out of our way for such a paltry number. Then, again, an artillery force was somehow out of joint with our notion of what Octavius should do to help suppress the rebellion. Infantry men with muskets we could all understand, could all be if necessary. Many of the farmer boys round about, too, made good cavalrymen, because they knew both how to ride and how to groom a horse. But in the name of all that was mysterious, why artillerymen? There had never been a cannon within 50 miles of Octavius, that is, since the Revolution. Certainly none of our citizens had the least idea how to fire one off. These enlisted men of Battery G were no better posted than the rest. It would take them a 3 days' journey to reach the point where for the first time they were to see their strange weapon of warfare. This seemed to us rather foolish. Moreover, there was a government proclamation just out, it was said, discontinuing further enlistments and disbanding the recruiting offices scattered over the North. This appeared to imply that the war was about over, or at least that they had more soldiers already than they knew what to do with. There were some who questioned whether, under these circumstances, it was worthwhile for Battery G to go at all. But go it did, and at the last moment quite a throng of people found themselves gathered at the station to say goodbye. A good many of these were the relations and friends of the dozen ordinary recruits who would not even get their uniforms and swords till they reached Tecumseh. But the larger portion, I should think, had come on account of Lieutenant Ransom. Dwight was hail fellow, well met with more people within a radius of 20 miles or so, probably, than any other man in the district. He was a good-looking young man, rather stocky in build and deeply sunburned. Through the decent months of the year he was always out of doors, either tramping over the country with a level over his shoulder, or improving the days with a shotgun or fishpole. At these seasons he was generally to be found of an evening at the barber's shop, where he told more new stories than anyone else. When winter came, his chief work was in his office, drawing maps and plans. He let his beard grow then, and spent his leisure for the most part playing checkers at the Excelsior Hotel. His habitual free and easy dress and amiable laxity of manners tended to obscure in the village mind the facts that he came from one of the best families of the section, that he had been through college, and that he had some means of his own. His mother and sisters were very respectable people indeed, and had one of the most expensive pews in the Episcopal Church. It was not observed, however, that Dwight ever accompanied them thither, or that he devoted much of his time to their society at home. It began to be remarked here and there that it was getting to be about time for Dwight Ransom to steady down, if he was ever going to. Although everybody liked him and was glad to see him about, an impression was gradually shaping itself that he never would amount to much. All at once Dwight staggered the public consciousness by putting on his best clothes one Sunday and going with his folks to church. Those who saw him on the way there could not make it out at all, except on the hypothesis that there had been a death in the family. Those who encountered him upon his return from the sacred edifice, however, found a clue to the mystery ready-made. He was walking home with Julia Parmalee. There were others whose passionate desire it was to walk home with Julia. They had been enlivening Octavius with public displays of their rivalry for something like 2 months when Dwight appeared on the scene as a competitor. Easy-going as he was in ordinary matters, he revealed himself now to be a hustler in the courts of love. It took him but a single day to drive the teller of the bank from the field. The principal of the seminary, a rising young lawyer, and the head bookkeeper at the freight house severally went by the board within a fortnight. There remained old Dr. Conger's son Emery, who was of a tougher fiber and gave Dwight several added weeks of combat. He enjoyed the advantage of having nothing whatever to do. He possessed, moreover, a remarkably varied wardrobe and white hands, and loomed unique among the males of our town in his ability to play on the piano. With such aids, a young man may go far in a quiet neighborhood, and for a time Emery Conger certainly seemed to be holding his own, if not more. His discomfiture, when it came, was dramatic in its swift completeness. One forenoon we saw Dwight on the street in a new and resplendent officer's uniform, and learned that he had been commissioned to raise a battery. That very evening the doctor's son left town, and the news went round that Lieutenant Ransom was engaged to Miss Parmalee. An impression prevailed that Dwight would not have objected to let the matter rest there. He had gained his point, and might well regard the battery and the war itself as things which had served their purpose and could now be dispensed with. No one would have blamed him much for feeling that way about it, but this was not Julia's view. Oh! She adopted the battery for her own, while it was still little more than a name, and swept it forward with such a swirling rush of enthusiasm that the men were all enlisted, the organization settled, and the date of departure for the front sternly fastened before anybody could lay a hand to the brakes. Her St. Mark's Ladies' Aid Society presented Dwight with a sword. Her branch of the Sanitary Commission voted to entertain the battery with a hot meal in the depot yard before it took the train. We have seen how she went and had herself photographed standing proudly behind the belted and marshaled Dwight. After these things it was impossible for Battery G to back out. The artillerymen had a bright blue sky and a warm sunlit noontide for their departure. Even the most cynical of those who had come to see them off yielded toward the end to the genial influence of the weather and the impulse of good fellowship, and joined in the handshaking at the car windows, and in the volley of cheers which were raised as the train drew slowly out of the yard. At this moment the ladies of the Sanitary Commission had to bestir themselves to save the remnant of oranges and sandwiches on their tables from the swooping raid of the youth of Octavius, and, what with administering cuffs and shakings, and keeping their garments out of the way of coffee cups overturned in the scramble, had no time to watch Julia Parmalee. The men gathered in the yard kept her steadily in view, however, as she stood prominently in front of the throng on the top of a baggage truck and waved her handkerchief until the train had dwindled into nothingness down the valley. These observers had an eye also on three young men who had got as near this truck as possible. Interest in Dwight and his battery was already giving place to curiosity as to which of these three, the bank teller, the freight house clerk, or the rising young lawyer, would win the chance of helping Julia down off her perch. No one was prepared for what really happened. Miss Parmalee turned and looked thoughtfully, one might say abstractedly, about her. Somehow she seemed not to see any of the hands which were eagerly uplifted toward her. Instead, her musing gaze roved lightly over the predatory scuffle among the tables, over the ancient depot building, over the assembled throng of citizens in the background, then wandered nearer with the pretty inconsequence of a butterfly's flight. Of course, it was the farewell to Dwight which had left that soft, rosy flush in her dark, round cheeks. The glance that she was sending idly fluttering here and there did not seem so obviously connected with the lieutenant. Of a sudden it halted and went into a smile. "Oh, Mr. Pulford!" "May I trouble you?" she said in very distinct tones, bending forward over the edge of the truck and holding forth two white and most shapely hands. Marsena was standing fully 6 feet away. Like the others, he had been looking at Miss Parmalee, but with no hint of expectation in his eyes. This abrupt summons seemed to surprise him even more than it did the crowd. He started, changed color, fixed a wistful, almost pleading stare upon the sunlit vacancy just above the head of the enchantress, and confusedly fumbled with his glove tips as if to make bare his hands for this great function. Then, straightening himself, he slowly moved toward her like one in a trance. The rivals edged out of Marsena's way in dumbfounded silence, as if he had been walking in his sleep and waking were dangerous. He came up, made a formal bow, and lifted his gloved hands in chivalrous pretense of guiding the graceful little jump which brought Miss Parmalee to the ground, all with a pale, motionless face upon which shone a solemn ecstasy. It was Marsena's habit when out of doors to carry his right hand in the breast of his frock-coat. As he made an angle of his elbow now from sheer force of custom, Julia promptly took the movement as a proffer of physical support and availed herself of it. Marsena felt himself thrilling from top to toe at the touch of her hand upon his sleeve. If there rose in his mind an awkward consciousness that this sort of thing was unusual in Octavius by daylight, the embarrassment was only momentary. He held himself proudly erect and marched out of the depot yard with Miss Parmalee on his arm. As Homer Sage remarked that evening on the stoop of the Excelsior Hotel, this event made the departure of Battery G seem by comparison very small potatoes indeed. It was impossible for the twain not to realize that everybody was looking at them as they made their way up the shady side of the main street. But there is another language of the hands than that taught in deaf-mute schools, and Julia's hand seemed to tell Marsena's arm distinctly that she didn't care a bit. As for him, after that first nervous minute or two, the experience was all joy, joy so profound and overwhelming that he could only ponder it in dazzled silence. It is true that Julia was talking, rattling on with sprightly volubility about all sorts of things, but to Marsena her remarks no more invited answers than does so much enthralling music. When she stopped for a breath, he did not remember what she had been saying. He only knew how he felt. "I wish you'd come straight to the gallery with me," he said. "I'd like—" "Well, I swow," remarked Mr. Newton Shull, along in the later afternoon. "I didn't expect we'd make ourselves today, with Marsena away pretty near the whole forenoon, and all the folks down to the depot, and here it turns out way the best day we've had yet. Actually had to send people away." "Guess that didn't worry him much," commented the boy from where he sat on the workbench swinging his legs in idleness. Mr. Shull nodded his head suggestively. "No, I dare say not," he said. "I kind of begrudge not being an operator myself when such setters as that come in. She must have been up there full 2 hours, them two all by themselves, and the countrymen loafing around out in the reception room there, stomping their feet and grinding their teeth, just tired to death a waiting. It went agin my grain to tell them last two lots they'd have to come some other day, but I dunno, perhaps it's just as well. They'll go and tell it around that we've got more'n we can do, and that's good for business. But, all the same, it seemed to me as if he took considerable more time than was really needful. He can turn out 4 farmers in 15 minutes if he puts on a spurt, and here he was a full 2 hours and only 5 pictures of her to show for it. 6, said the boy. Yes, so it was, counting the one with her hair let down, Mr. Shull admitted. I dunno whether that one oughtn't to be a little extry. I thought of telling her that it would be, on account of so much hair consuming more chemicals, but I dunno, somehow. She sort of looked as if she knew better. Did you ever notice them eyes o' hern, how they look as if they could see straight through you and out on the other side? The boy shook his head. I don't bother my head about women, he said. Got something better to do. Guess that's a pretty good plan, too, mused Mr. Shull. Somehow you can't seem to make 'em out at all. Now I've been around a good deal, and yet somehow I don't feel as if I knew much about women. I'm bound to say, though, he added upon reflection, they know considerable about me. I suppose the first thing we know now, remarked the boy, impatiently changing the subject, McClellan'll be in Richmond. They say it's liable to happen now any day. Newton Shull was but a lukewarm patriot. They needn't hurry on my account, he said. It would be kind of mean to have the whole thing fizzle out now, just when the picture business has begun to amount to something. Why, we must have took in upwards of 11 today, frames and all, and 2 years ago we'd have been lucky to get in 3. Let's see, there's 2 50s and 5 35s, that's 2.75, and the Dutch boy with the drum, that's 3.40, counting the mat, and then there's Miss Parma Lee. 4 daguerreotypes and 2 negatives and small frames for each, and 2 large frames for crayons she's going to do herself, and cord and nails. I suppose she'll think them ought to be thrown in. What? Didn't you make her pay in advance? Asked the boy. I thought everybody had to. You got to humor some folks, explained Mr. Shull with a note of regret in his voice. These big bugs with plenty of money always have to be waited on. It ain't right, but it has to be. Besides, you can always slide on an extra quarter or so when you send in the bill. That sort of evens the thing up. Now, in her case, for instance, where we'd charge ordinary folks $1 for 2 daguerreotypes, we can send her in a bill for— Neither Mr. Shull nor the boy had heard Marsena's descending steps on the staircase, yet at this moment he entered the little workroom and walked across it to the bay window where the printing was done. There was an unusual degree of abstraction in his face and mien, unusual even for him, and he drummed absent-mindedly on the panes as he stood looking out at the street or the sky or whatever it was his listless gaze beheld. How much do you think it'd be safe to stick Miss Parmalee a piece for them daguerreotypes? Asked Newton Shull of his partner. Marsena turned and stared for a moment as if he doubted having heard aright. Then he made curt answer, She is not to be charged anything at all. They were made for her as presents. It was the other partner's turn to stare. Well, of course, if you say it's all right, he managed to get out, but I suppose on the frames we can. The frames are presents too, said Marsena with decision. 4. During the fortnight or 3 weeks following the departure of Battery G, it became clear to everyone that the war was as good as over. It had lasted already a whole year, but now the end was obviously at hand. The Union Army had the rebels cooped up in Yorktown, the identical place where the British had been compelled to surrender at the close of the Revolution, and it was impossible that they should get away. The very coincidence of locality was enough in itself to convince the most skeptical. We read that Fitzjohn Porter had a balloon fastened by a rope, in which he daily went up and took a look through his field glasses at the rebels, all miserably huddled together in their trap, awaiting their doom. Our soldiers wrote home now that final victory could only be a matter of a few weeks, or months at the most. Some of them said they would surely be home by haying time. Their letters no longer dwelt upon battles, or the prospect of battles, but gossiped about the jealousies and quarrels among our generals, who seemed to dislike one another much more than they did the common enemy, and told us long and quite incredible tales about the mud in Virginia. No soldier's letter that spring was complete without a chapter on the mud. There were stories about mules and their contraband drivers being bodily sunk out of sight in these weltering seas of mire, and of new boots being made for the officers to come up to their armpits, which we hardly knew whether to believe or not. But about the fact that peace was practically within view there could be no doubt. Under the influence of this mood, Miss Parmalee's ambitious project for a grand fair and festival in aid of the Field Hospital and Nurse Fund naturally languished. If the war was coming to a close so soon, there could be no use in going to so much worry and trouble, to say nothing of the expense. Miss Julia seemed to take this view of it herself. She ceased active preparations for the fair, and printed in the Thessaly Banner of Liberty a beautiful poem over her own name entitled The Dove-like Dawn of White-Winged Peace. She also got herself some new and summery dresses of gay tints and very fashionable form, and went to be photographed in each. Her almost daily presence at the gallery came, indeed, to be a leading topic of conversation in Octavius. Some said that she was taking lessons of Marsena, learning to make photographs, but others put a different construction on the matter and winked as they did so. As for Marsena, he moved about the streets these days with his head among the stars, in a state of rapt and reverent exaltation. He had never been what might be called a talker, but now it was as much as the best of us could do to get any kind of word from him. He did not seem to talk to Julia any more than to the general public, but just luxuriated with a dumb solemnity of joy in her company, sitting sometimes for hours beside her on the piazza of the Parmalee house, or focusing her pretty image with silent delight on the ground glass of his best camera day after day, or walking with her arm in arm to the Episcopal church on Sundays. He had always been a Presbyterian before, but now he bore himself in the prominent Parmalee pew at St. Sain. Marks with stately correctness, rising, kneeling, seating himself, just as the others did, and helping Miss Julia hold her prayer book with an air of having known the ritual from childhood. No doubt a good many people felt that all this was rough on the absent Dwight Ransom, and probably some of them talked openly about it. But interest in this aspect of the case was swallowed up in the larger attention now given to Marsena Pulford himself. It began to be reported that he really came of an extraordinarily good family in New England, and that an uncle of his had been in Congress. The legend that he had means of his own did not take much root, but it was admitted that he must now be simply coining money. Some went so far as to estimate his annual profits as high as 1/500, which sounded to the average Octavian like a dream. It was commonly understood that he had abandoned an earlier intention to buy a house and lot of his own, and this clearly seemed to show that he counted upon going presently to live in the Parmalee mansion. People speculated with idle curiosity as to the likelihood of this coming to pass before the war ended and Battery G returned home. Suddenly great and stirring news fell upon the startled North and set Octavius thrilling with excitement, along with every other community far and near. It was in the first week or so of May that the surprise came. The rebels, whom we had supposed to be securely locked up in Yorktown, with no alternative save starvation or surrender, decided not to remain there any longer, and accordingly marched comfortably off in the direction of Richmond. Quick upon the heels of this came tidings that the Union Army was in pursuit and that there had been savage fighting with the Confederate rear guard at Williamsburg. The papers said that the war, so far from ending, must now be fought all over again. The marvelous story of the Monitor and Merrimac sent our menfolks into a frenzy of patriotic fervor. Our women learned with sinking hearts that the new corps, which included our Dearborn County regiments, was to bear the brunt of the conflict in this changed order of things. We were all off again in a hysterical whirl of emotions, now pride, now horror, now bitter wrath on top. In the middle of all this, the famous Field Hospital and Nurse Fund Fair was held. The project had slumbered the while people thought peace so near. It sprang up with renewed and vigorous life the moment the echo of those guns at Williamsburg reached our ears. And of course at its head was Julia Parmalee. It would take a long time and a powerful ransacking of memory to catalogue the remarkable things which this active young woman did toward making that fair the success it undoubtedly was. Even more notable were the things which she coaxed, argued, or shamed other folks into doing for it. Years afterward, there were old people who would tell you that Octavius had never been quite the same place since. For one thing, instead of the Fireman's Hall with its dingy aspect and somewhat rowdyish associations, the fair was held in the courthouse, and we all understood that Miss Julia had been able to secure this favor on account of her late uncle, the judge, when anyone else would have been refused. It was under her tireless and ubiquitous supervision that this solemn old interior now took on a gay and festal face. Under the inspiration of her glance, the members of the fire company and the alert baseball club vied with each other in borrowing flags and hanging them from the most inaccessible and adventurous points. The rivalry between the local Freemasons and Oddfellows was utilized to build temporary booths at the sides and down the center on a floor laid over the benches by the Carpenters' Benevolent Association. The ladies' organizations of the various churches, out of devotion to the union and jealousy of one another, did all the rest. At the sides were the stalls for the sale of useful household articles, and sedate and elderly matrons found themselves now dragged from the mild obscurity of homes where they did their own work, and thrust forward to preside over the sales in these booths, while thrifty, not to say penurious, merchants came and stood around and regarded with amazement the merchandise which they had been wheedled into contributing gratis out of their own stores. The suggestion that they should now buy it back again paralyzed their faculties and imparted a distinct restraint to the festivities at the sides of the big courtroom. In the center was a double row of booths for the sale of articles not so strictly useful, and here the young people congregated. All the girls of Octavius seemed to have been gathered here. The pretty ones and the plain ones, the saucy ones and the shy, the maidens who were getting along, and the damsels not yet out of their teens. Stith, spreading crinolines, brushed juvenile pantalettes, and the dark head of long, shaving-like ringlets contrasted itself with the bold waterfall of blonde hair. These girls did not know one another very well, save by little groups formed around the nucleus of a church association, and very few of them knew Miss Parmalee at all, except, of course, by sight. But now, astonishing to relate, she recognized them by name as old friends, shook hands warmly right and left, and blithely set them all to work and at their ease. The idea of selling things to young men abashed them by its weird and unmaidenly novelty. She showed them how it should be done, bringing forward for the purpose a sheepishly obstinate drugstore clerk, and publicly dragooning him into paying 80 cents for a leather dog collar, despite his protest that he had no dog and hated the whole canine species, and could get such a strap as that anywhere for 15 cents, all amid the greatest merriment. Her influence was so pervasive, indeed, that even the nicest girls soon got into a state of giggling familiarity with comparative strangers, which gave their elders concern, and which in some cases it took many months to straighten out again. But for the time all was sparkling gaiety. On the second and final evening after the oyster supper, the Philharmonics played and a choir of girls sang patriotic songs. Then the gas was turned down and the stereopticon show began. As the last concerted achievement of the firm of Pulford and Shull, this magic lantern performance is still remembered. The idea of it, of course, was Julia's. She suggested it to Marsena, and he gladly volunteered to make any number of positive plates from appropriate pictures and portraits for the purpose. Then she pressed Newton Shull into the service to get a stereopticon on hire, to rig up the platform and canvas for it, and finally to consent to quit his post among the Philharmonics when the music ceased, and to go off up into the gallery to work the slides. He also, during Marsena's absence one day, made a slide on his own account. Mr. Shull had not taken very kindly to the idea when Miss Julia first broached it to him. "No, I don't know as I ever worked a stereopticon," he said, striving to look with cold placidity into the winsome and beaming smile with which she confronted him one day out in the reception room. She had never smiled at him before or pretended even to know his name. "I guess you'd better hire a man up from Tecumseh to bring the machine and run it himself." "But you can do it so much better, my dear Mr. Shull," she urged. "You do everything so much better. Mr. Pulford often says that he never knew such a handy man in all his life. It seems that there is literally nothing that you can't do, except, perhaps, refuse a lady a great personal favor." Miss Julia put this last so delicately, and with such a pretty little arch nod of the head and turn of the eyes, that Newton Shull surrendered at discretion. He promised everything on the spot, and he kept his word. In fact, he more than kept it. The great evening came, as I have said, and when the lights were turned down to extinction's verge, those who were nearest the front could distinguish the vacant chair which Mr. Shull had been occupying, with his bass viol leaning against it. They whispered from one to another that he had gone up in the gallery to work this new-fangled contrivance. Then came a flashing broad disk of light on the screen above the judge's bench, a spreading sibilant murmur of interest, and the show began. It was an oddly limited collection of pictures, mainly thin and feeble copies of newspaper engravings, photographic portraits, and ideal heads from the magazines. Winfield Scott followed in the wake of Kossuth, and Garibaldi led the way for John C. Fremont and Lola Montez. There was applause for the long, homely, familiar face of Lincoln, and a derisive snicker for the likeness of Jeff Davis turned upside down. Then came local heroes from the district round about: Jenn, Boyce, Cole, McIntyre, and young Adjety. Harron, who had died so bravely at Bull's Bluff, mixed with some landscapes and statuary, and a comic caricature or two. The rapt assemblage murmured its recognitions, sighed its deeper emotions, chuckled over the funny plates, deeming it all a most delightful entertainment. From time to time there were long hitches marked by a curious spluttering noise above, and the abortive flashes of meaningless light on the screen, and the explanation was passed about in undertones that Mr. Shull was having difficulties with the machine. It was after the longest of these delays that, all at once, an extremely vivid picture was jerked suddenly upon the canvas and, after a few preliminary twitches, settled in place to stare us out of countenance. There was no room for mistake. There was no room for mistake. It was the portrait of Miss Julia Parmalee standing proudly erect in statuesque posture, with one hand resting on the back of a chair, and seated in this chair was left Dwight Ransom, smiling amiably. There was a moment's deadly hush while we gazed at this unlooked-for apparition. It seemed, upon examination, as if there was a certain irony in the lieutenant's grin. Someone in the darkness emitted an abrupt snort of amusement, and a general titter arose, hung in the air for an awkward instant, and then was drowned by a generous burst of applause. While the people were still clapping their hands, the picture was withdrawn from the screen, and we heard Newton Shaw call down from his perch in the gallery, "You kin turn up the lights now." They ain't no more to this. In another minute we were sitting once again in the broad glare of the gaslight, blinking confusedly at one another, and with a dazed consciousness that something rather embarrassing had happened. The boldest of us began to steal glances across to where Miss Parmalee and Marsena sat, just in front of the steps to the bench. What Miss Julia felt was beyond guessing, but there she was, at any rate, bending over and talking vivaciously, all smiles and collected nerves, to a lady 2 seats removed. But Marsena displayed no such presence of mind. He sat bolt upright with an extraordinarily white face and a drooping jaw, staring fixedly at the empty canvas on the wall before him. Such absolute astonishment was never depicted on human visage before. Perhaps from native inability to mind his own business, perhaps with a kindly view of saving an anxious situation, the Baptist minister rose now to his feet, coughed loudly to secure attention, and began some florid remarks about the success of the fair, the especial beauty of the lantern exhibition they had just witnessed, and the felicitous way in which it had terminated with a portrait of the beautiful and distinguished young lady to whose genius and unwearying efforts they were all so deeply indebted. In these times of national travail and distress, he said, there was a peculiar satisfaction in seeing her portrait accompanied by that of one of the courageous and noble young men who had sprung to the defense of their country. The poet had averred, he continued, that none but the brave deserved the fair, and so on and so on.